all of who I am and what I do. And so I like to make that clear when I come on other people's programs like this, is that I think we should be actively involved in spiritual disciplines and evangelism, apologetics, and reaching the lost, engaging the culture and the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's an obvious thing. This happens to be what I wrote my dissertation on. As Dr. Braxton Hunter, the president of the seminary where I go, calls me, the soteriologist. And so that happens to be one particular area or field of study that I happen to kind of major in, so to speak, from a theological perspective, not a philosophical perspective. As I mentioned to you in an email, I'm not a philosopher by trade. I am a theologian. And so my biggest concern is, what does the Bible say? What is the Bible intending for us to learn when we read it? And that's where I have some disagreements with some of the conclusions that Calvinists come to when reading the scripture.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that. And my first experience with you was actually the Romans 9 debate that you had with Dr. James White. Shocker, but I listened to Dr. James White quite a bit. It's almost like I'm a Reformed Baptist online, right? But at any rate, so yeah, that was my. And since then, of course, we've had our own discussion. I've watched a number of your shows, and I've also seen a couple more of the debates. You recently did one with Joel Webbin that I thought was very interesting. Mainly because well, to be perfectly frank, I never thought that Joel Webbin was a debater. He does a lot of his what would you even call that? It's like video blogging, I guess, which is very cool. And he's got his podcast, which is very cool, but I never thought he would debate it. And then I hadn't seen you in a debate almost, I think, since when we had a conversation. I don't know if you have since then, but I just haven't personally seen it. And so to see you two not only together, but in an in-person debate was actually very cool.
It was a good discussion. I enjoyed Joel is like you, and the very kind, in the sense of his ability to keep things mature and cordial. And I think we had a profitable discussion there.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the audience, if any of you guys are interested, definitely consider checking that out. So let's go ahead and jump into our topic today. So I wanted to, for those who don't know, this actually has started a while back, in that this is originally what I wanted our debate topic to be about, but we ended up coming to the conclusion that for an actual debate, that might not be the best idea. Fast forward about a year or so, and now we're here having a discussion about it, which is probably a better format anyways. But nevertheless, the topic that we were wanting to address today is essentially this idea we have in Calvinism of God ordaining all things, and of course the emphasis being on evil things, not the emphasis from Calvinists, but the emphasis in discussion, right? Because there's obviously some questions that people have, some concerns, some critiques, arguments against when we start talking about a thrice holy God ordaining things such as not just emotional or natural or anything like that evils, but even moral evils. So I wanted to have a conversation about that here today. Now, before I lay out some of the stuff that I think will be hot button, specifics for us to discuss, what is your understanding of this kind of doctrine, and what is your own personal views on it, on this entire theodicy of God being the ordainer of all things?
Seems like the Westminster Confession doesn't want to come out and say God determined Adam and Eve to fall. Although they want to say it, but then they don't want to commit to it. So I think you could follow the Westminster Confession and then, which I think he's going to read here, but you could say it's compatible with the idea that God did that, but it seems like the fact that what they say, after they say God ordains all things that come to pass unchangeably, they turn around and say, I don't know, you could interpret it either way. It just seems like the narrative of the Bible does not suggest that Adam and Eve had to fall. Seems evident to me. This is my opinion. In fact, I would say this is a very foundational thing too, right? I want to say because of the way Ezekiel 28 is, by the way the creation story is described, the things that James says about all good things come from God, all bad things come from the world. You can always say, well, but ultimately God decided for it. But the Bible doesn't say that. So does the writer want you to think that? It seems to me no. The writer does not want you to think that God unchangeably made it so that they fall. The writer is not trying to say, it's not like a secret. To me, that's like, oh, look what I figured out. It's actually true that God wanted them to ultimately. Does the narrative want us to think that? I would say no. And so I would want to say our theology should not be developed out of such a notion, because the text is like, you have to deduce that from philosophical ideas. Now, the Bible doesn't say one way or the other, free will or determinism or whatever. Fine. But what does the weight of the evidence suggest? And people say, well, that's not my intuition about the text. Well, I don't, this is like an epistemological issue. Like, if you came to the Bible without any bias, would you get the idea that the text wants us to think that God made it so they had to fall? I would say seems not to me. But of course, I'm biased to that view, right? Well, you could like list all the reasons to say one way or the other. And this is why we use words like permit. And this is like, why do so many Calvinists accidentally start using permission language when you listen to them preach? Many of them. Does that prove anything? Well, to me, it suggests that we all intuitively know that God is separate from evil in such a way that makes sense to us. Like when we consider the guilt of a person, we tend to consider mitigating circumstances in a court case. That seems justice. That seems like justice to us. And so, in other words, we don't say the groomed sex worker is at the same level of moral guilt for their promiscuity as the person who was, say, abused as a child. In other words, it's not black and white, but we notice that we consider the circumstances and assign culpability, and we feel good about that's right. Now, if that is right, that is, if a man murders somebody and we find out one guy, did it because he felt like it, and the other guy did it reluctantly because his family was kidnapped and they were torturing his family if he didn't do what they said, and they told him to murder somebody, that guy's not as guilty as the guy who just was getting his jollies one night on his own accord for murder. That seems right. But it seems to me, if that's true, God determining that they had to fall and them falling by their own accord without God determining it, they seem like more guilty in the circumstance where God didn't determine it in that such a way where they had no other option, ultimately, by God's decree ahead of time. In fact, they kind of seem like they're a victim in that case of a setup. That's what I would say. Hopefully that makes sense. Like, isn't it true that person, like, if someone set you up in such a way where you couldn't do otherwise, it seems like you're a victim of grooming, in other words.
things.
Well, a lot of people accuse me or think that I don't believe God is in control. There's just a big difference between God being in control and choosing to meticulously control everything. You can say, for example, Phil, the supervisor or the boss over our department, is in control of our Center for Church Health. And he is, but that doesn't mean he chooses to micromanage every decision that all his directors make. He can choose as the manager to give us certain level of autonomy, and doesn't mean that we're more powerful than he is or bigger than he is or higher up on the scale than he is. It means that it's his right as a manager to allow us to manage certain aspects of our own job. And that's it well within his prerogative. In the same way, God's in control, but that doesn't mean he has chosen to meticulously control all our thoughts, actions, decisions, desires, and everything that takes place. Now, what gets confusing philosophically, and this is what I was telling CJ in the email, this is not my field of study. I know that Eric Hernandez and Tim Stratton and Braxton Hunter and so many others are more trained in philosophy and get into the Molinistic discussions, or maybe even with Warren and your discussion with him as more of a dynamic perspective. Those are the philosophical groups that attempt to handle the problem of determinism within the concept of God's knowledge and how all that works. I don't particularly find that discussion all that interesting. I mean, I get involved in it obviously because of the role that I'm in with this particular, but what interests me is really more biblical revelation. What is the Bible leading us to understand about who God is and how he's chosen to interact with the world? If people want to speculate as to how knowledge works within time and space, with an infinite all-knowing being and all those kinds of things, and you get into all the philosophical speculations of how all that plays itself out, sometimes my eyes kind of glaze over when it comes to those kinds of discussions, to be honest, just because I don't think that they're all that relevant nor practical when it comes to daily life and living. Though they're fun discussions, as I know that you love that as a theology geek like myself and a philosopher, you like to talk through those things, and I understand that. I'm with you there, but there's certain aspects of that discussion that seem to be beyond the scope of what Scripture really reveals. And anytime you're getting into those portions of the discussion, I think we've got to tread very lightly, and I don't think you can speak with great dogmatism when you're speaking about things outside of the direct revelation of Scripture.
Yeah, and of course, how would I say this? I have always been, and I joked with you in the emails, like technically, I'm not an expert on either. I just cosplay as one. Of course, I do spend virtually all of my time studying philosophy and theology, but I don't have any degrees, is what I mean. And I can certainly see the overlap between them, though, of course, there's also wide differences as well, which is part of the reason why you tend to see, for example, a William Lane Craig will argue, significantly different than somebody like you will, because you're coming at it from two fundamentally different perspectives, even though there's a Venn diagram there. Right. The whole point of a Venn diagram, of course, is that the majority of the information is on either side, right? There's only that small part in the middle. There has always been a question for me that I feel like almost is unavoidable, which is a tad philosophical, which is this idea of it's hard for me to distinguish the difference between a being in God's control allowing something and determining something. And then, to be clear, I think this only applies to a being in God's position, because we, of course, are not, omnipotent. We are not all-knowing. We are not eternal or sovereign or anything like that. But I do wonder sometimes, I was having a conversation with a Catholic YouTuber named John Buck, and he had said, well, if I were to let a lion loose and it killed a zebra, I didn't determine that the lion killed the zebra. And I kind of chuckled a little bit and said, well, yes, but if you put the zebra in a 4x4 room and you made the lion hungry and then you put it in the room, I'd be hard pressed to say that you didn't determine it, even though you weren't meticulously controlling the lion, right? You certainly set it up in such a way that you got exactly what you wanted, in other words. Now, I want to get to the scriptures very quickly, but just on that point very briefly, I assume that you might not agree with my rendering there, right? Of how it's hard for me to really see a difference when you have God setting up everything.
Okay, so I've been thinking about this regarding God's foreknowledge and some thoughts I had about God's. Yeah, okay, we think of God as like when we think about thinking through an idea, right? It takes time, and so you're limited when we think about thinking or considering like circumstances and like potential outcomes. Like we're limited by our ability to process the information, right? Now, if you like consider God as not being limited by space and time, like he doesn't have to like go through a Rolodex of like, which takes like, X amount of time to like consider, oh, this person and then that person, right? Like it seems to me, most people would say, well, doesn't have like processing limitation, right? In his quote unquote brain or mind, right? So like all knowledge is present knowledge all at once. You could even say it's timeless, right? Which has its problems with like how you could even think of God as like any kind of personal being at that point, right? He's just like this knowledge bank. How could he have like, how could you have emotions, right? You just are, you just exist, and like everything's present at once, all knowledge, all like, and so when you consider like this idea of middle knowledge where like if this then that, right? Well, I think to deny that God can't think of hypotheticals and know their outcomes, that's stupid, because that would be like a limitation. So if all knowledge is present, in other words, so what's the issue? Is the thing is, if we're going to say God's knowledge is not determining necessarily, right? So like how does God know the future? Because he's determining it? Well, no, not necessarily. That's not determination, that's just knowledge. Well, it seems problematic if God's like dealing himself cards that he doesn't know, what he's not in control of it, because he's picking from possible worlds what free creatures will do. And so he's like determining the free will choices by choosing the world where people freely do this or that. And that seems kind of weird. Like he like generates this world and then it comes up in the auction of his mind and he goes, do I want that one? Nope. Okay, next. Because I got to see what these people are doing. There's something wrong with that idea. It doesn't really work. But neither does God determining all evil that happens, because he wants it that way ultimately, secretly, or whatever, in his ultimate will. That seems stupid too to me, just to be frank about it. But so like, how can God make a world with free creatures? You might think, well, it's either that he determines the free will, what will happen, and then we call that free will, but people couldn't have done otherwise. Otherwise they would thwart God's foreknowledge because they do otherwise. And if he knows it ahead of time and he sets that world in motion, then you might as well call that determined, which is what the Calvinists would say. I think there's something wrong with all those ideas, and that the self-evident revelation of Scripture is that people are free, therefore responsible in the way that we understand justice and freedom and responsibility. How can that work? And some people will say, well, then God doesn't know the future, because to know the future was to determine the future. And determine the future is to make people not guilty or responsible. Because it seems to me that they couldn't have done otherwise, but they can't do otherwise because God wouldn't know it. Okay, what's the impasse? Well, some people say the only option would be then open theism, which is heresy, and I'm going to say, well, it does seem like you kind of end up limiting God to such a point where it doesn't make sense, because like I can predict what people will do if I know them well enough. And no one wants to say God doesn't know us as well as we know ourselves, if not, or that better than we know ourselves. So how do we make this? How can we think through it? Well, okay, considering the present of all knowledge, right? Okay, well, if you're going to deny God has middle knowledge, that's stupid too, because God can obviously hypothetically consider if this, then that would happen, but whether it will ever happen or not, he can say whether if this, then that. And it can be something that never actually obtains in reality. So I wonder if, because I've jokingly said I'm an open theist, I just think God knows the future. And I think there's something about that that's right, in the sense that there's some sort of more robust responsibility for humans, and God is absolutely in control and has knowledge of it. Is that possible? Well, what if What if we're just not thinking about knowledge right? Like, what's the difference if all actual reality is present tense known to God without limitation of time and space? So in other words, he doesn't have to like over time think through all the possibilities and their potential outcomes. And while he's doing that, stuff happens that he's, with his eye watchfully over it or whatever. What if it doesn't even really matter? Because God, if you know every what if potential and you know every possibility all at the same moment in time, if you will, if it's all present knowledge, it seems to me that you could, in a sense, you could say it is open, but because God knows everything he would do or will do in every potential succession of events in time and space, you could say it's like he's always going to react a certain way to certain outcomes, and he's always going to get his outcome, and he knows all the potential outcomes and what he'll do about it is a response to what people do. Like all of a sudden, like open theism and perfect foreknowledge don't even really make sense if both sides grant that all potential knowledge or what if propositions, if then propositions, are present known to God at one moment. At the same time, all things that will happen are present all at one moment. That you can't take somebody by surprise. That's timeless in that sense. And so we truly are open. It seems to detach the knowledge from the necessity of God's foreknowledge. In other words, he's not determining what will happen because he decreed it in that strong sense, but that's not a limitation to people being free, because he's always going to respond in a certain way. He's always going to respond to certain things that occur. And if he lays out the game plan and the rules to how he will respond and has made that known, and he wants to demonstrate his character, which he's going to do anyway because of who he is, seems like maybe there's some way to go that direction. I don't know. Maybe that didn't make any sense. Essentially, it's like it's saying it's open, but God's not taken by surprise if he knows every potential outcome at the same moment, always. That's not really a limitation for the future to be open in the sense where we're actually not being determined. Anyway, that's my musings about it. Oh, there's CJ. Sorry, I don't know how long you were there. I was staring off into space trying to articulate what I was saying.
Really good.
So what do you get what I'm saying at all? Does it make any sense at all? Probably not.
I don't know if I necessarily get it, to be honest, but of course I'm here now, so we can just talk about it, right? But thus far, I guess I'm not sure that I get it.
Like, what's the problem with like what do you think the problem is that stems from like open theism? For it, I think that's where I would start. It's I'll just say real quick. It seems to me that the problem is like if you're saying like God doesn't know what free creatures will do, then this starts to make God like not know anything. When you start trailing that down, when you start just like considering that, like what's limiting his knowledge, it's just like he can't figure out what people are going to do next. It's like, where are you going to like draw that line in the sand, and then you just turn God into like an unbiblical idea, right? But I don't think that's what they're trying to say with open theists necessarily. They're like, when you listen to some of the caveats that some of the more intelligent ones say, I would say that they're not necessarily going in that direction. That they're trying to say, like, I don't know. I'll stop there. I'll just let you say something.
Well, I think the problems with open theism are multifaceted, unfortunately, and it's unfortunate for them. But, first off, there's just the obvious. It just flatly denies clear biblical revelation. And to be very, very pointed about this, I think that, there are certain times where I have to word something like, well, I think it's clear that, and then I'll say whatever the position is that I think is clearly laid out in Scripture, right? And then there's other times where the I think qualifier is almost dishonest because it's just very plain. You know what I mean? Like when we speak with somebody who denies the divinity of Christ, I'm not going to tell them I think that this verse says thus and such, because it just very plainly does. And if I'm communicating to you this idea of like this is my interpretation, I'm almost lying to you because I'm giving you an understanding that I think this is up for interpretation, and I'm just simply giving you my best arithmetic and just, as far as figuring it out and stuff like that. And open theism I put into that category where it's like that I can't lie to you and say that I think this is up for debate. Scripture is just very plainly telling us that God knows the future. He doesn't just know what he'll do, but he knows what you'll do, and he knows what I'll do, and he knows what my cats will do, and he knows what the ocean will do, and he knows when it/he/they/us whatever will do it, right? And it just exhausts the language to say that. So that's the first problem I see with open theism. I think the second problem is, we talk about God as the objective standard, the uncaused first cause, and so on, right? Well, he can't be the standard for what is and is not knowledge if there's stuff that he doesn't know, right? Now there's a standard. In this case, the standard, some people would say it's just the brute facts that are knowledge, and that God is bound by those brute facts. Maybe some would say that there's something outside of him that creates things and makes things true. But if we think that God is supposed to be the standard for what is and is not knowledge, for what is and is not true, if the principle of sufficient reason ultimately boils down to God as the sufficient reason, right, then we can't say that God doesn't know things because he's not then the sufficient reason, right? He's not the measuring stick. To something else outside of him is at that point the measuring stick, which I think is very problematic. And then, of course, there's the problem of him just being kind of, impotent on that view, which is
yeah. But what about the obvious implications of him determining evil? It seems like the Bible doesn't teach that. So, like, what do we do with that?
Well, I think that I think the first thing we need to recognize is just that I don't know, and I know that people get uncomfortable when I talk like this, but I just think God is a lot less concerned about that idea than we are. I mean, he just says, I create evil in Isaiah 45:7, or is there evil in the city and the Lord has not done it in Amos 3:8. Now, I think that there is a deeper level to that than just simply God is some capricious tyrant who's doing evil things, which I think is the fear a non-Calvinist has. But I'll admit it makes me chuckle a little bit when the non-Calvinist will speak, like, well, you are by implication saying that God has created evil, and the Bible doesn't teach that. And it's like, well, with respect, my friend, he just says it in those exact words. So, like, you're a whole lot of concern. You have a whole lot of concern over a doctrine that God doesn't seem to care a whole lot about.
So what do you think God would have said to Satan if he had argued like a determinist and said, I just, Adam's, I've never really gotten anybody to respond to this per se, other than like a snicker or whatever. But I'm serious. Like when Adam said to God, it was Eve. What do you think God was thinking? Like, seems like I want to say God was saying, dude, stop passing the buck. And then Eve says, well, it was the snake, right? And I think God was thinking, that's not wrong, but you're responsible too. And like, so try to answer me, like, because I'll tell you what I think. It's like, if the snake had said, yes, but God, you determined all things, and so I'm just doing what you determined me to do, what would God have said?
Yeah, well, I think that
I just don't think he would have said, yeah, I determined you because my ultimate will says I actually just wanted you to do that. Like, would that be true? It seems like that wouldn't be true.
Well, I think you kind of answered your own question in a sense, right? Because you said how, Adam says, yeah, but the woman, and God says, he obviously asks the woman the question. So it's not as if he's saying Adam is entirely wrong.
Right.
At the same time, Adam bears the brunt of the curse because Adam did it by his own free volition, right? I think that would be a similar response. I think that because I believe compatibilism is true, I think God could say, this is precisely what my sovereign plan is. And also, you freely decided to be an actor in this play, and therefore you bear the brunt of this penalty. So to me, it kind of sounds like in the confines of your question was already the answer to the question by way of just using the Adam and Eve example. Because, Adam is still guilty for what he's done. At the same time, it's acknowledged that Eve had some part to play in it. And then there's a question. Notice, God doesn't go immediately to saying Eve is somehow morally culpable. He asks her a question, right? Almost as if he doesn't actually need to figure it out, of course. But it's like he's playing detective trying to see, okay, is Eve really culpable? Now, of course, we know, because we believe he knows all things, that he already knew that Eve was culpable. But at least for the sake of the narrative, that is investigated ever so slightly to see if such and such is actually true. If you get to the investigation part of God, I don't think you can say he is culpable. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that.
What if Eve had said, like, do you think Adam and Eve were compatibles?
I think so. I think they probably had a lot.
How do I want to go with this? So, okay, where do you think sin began? Because the snake's already evil. He must have been a sinner before he tempted Eve. Do you think?
Yeah, I would say that if we're talking about all of it and not just simply what Adam and Eve did, or humanity, in other words, whenever Lucifer fell, that is probably the first sin of all time.
So my tradition says that Christ was talking, just to make this a little more interesting. Adventists have this idea that because of what Ellen White wrote, that in heaven, Satan was like, it didn't just happen suddenly. Like, pride rose up in his heart, and he started, and then like Christ went to Satan and was like he hadn't in other words, he was starting to rebel, but he hadn't been cast out yet. And so the idea would be that there was conversation where, like, you're going, like, kind of like with Cain and Abel, right? Like, sin crouches at your door, sort of thing. Like I guess we could just go to that because it's in the Bible or whatever. It is a little more interesting when it's the first sin, though, right? The mystery of iniquity. But obviously you would probably say that doesn't really make sense on compatibilism, would it? Or what am I missing here? Like, why did God tell Cain sin crouches at your door? Like, it's kind of makes it seem like he is at a crossroads or something, I would say. What would you say?
Yeah, I would think I could just totally agree with that. I think that and this is why I always try to tell people when we want to debate these kinds of issues or even discuss, because we're obviously not in a formal setting here, but we really should be asking the question of, does compatibilism actually work as a concept? Because when we say, okay, well, what about X example? If we haven't actually addressed whether or not compatibilism works as a concept, then what the answer essentially becomes, well, as a believer in compatibilism, I think that he was free to choose something else, at least in some instance, right? And so what you ultimately boil down to is this question is, okay, if each individual example that can be given ultimately has the same answer, which is compatibilism, therefore it is both free and determined, then the question needs to shift to, okay, is compatibilism as a concept viable, right? Because if it's not viable, then I can no longer answer in that way. And if it is viable, then an example of free choice or crossroads or something like that can't be taken as an example of determinism being false. You see what I mean?
Right. Determinism can always, I would say compatibilism is like, it just, there's certain circumstances where it kind of starts to feel like it's like determinism's true, but the person's still guilty, and that seems wrong to me. But the idea of, I guess just, it starts to make it, like in these early stories of the Bible, it starts to make it seem less viable, because it seems like it's like God's just declaring them guilty, but they're kind of seem like victims, in the sense where like it's a setup in such a way that only gets free of such a thing. And by setup, I mean it's dishonest in the sense where it's like he's not really encouraging him to not go that direction, because he's already determined that he's going to go that direction. And then you might say, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so what I was going to say is, can I challenge that notion for a moment? Because you may have heard in this conversation I had with Dr. Flowers, which, for the record, as I said last time I had a debate with him, he is a wonderful man. I do very much appreciate his time. Obviously completely disagree with him, but nevertheless, I brought up the argument of, if I can show you even one example of compatibilism being biblically true, then there's two arguments at that point that can never be used again. And now I want to be clear here. If I can show one example, that does not mean compatibilism proper is true. In other words, if you can show one example where something is determined, but also an agent freely chose it and was held responsible, that doesn't mean that's the way everything works, right?
Right.
But what it does mean is we can never again use the argument God can't hold people accountable for something he determined.
You're cutting in and out for some reason.
Sorry, is this any better?
Yeah, that's good.
So like I said, it doesn't mean that the idea of compatibilism itself is true if I can show one instance. But if I can show one instance, it does mean we can never say that it's illogical or logically impossible, right? Because a logical impossibility by necessity is something that could not ever happen because it violates the rules of logic. And it also...
Well, it would appear that it would mean it's a viable concept biblically.
Well, that's true as well, right? It would also mean that it's something that Scripture, at least in one instance, affirms. So actually, I could add three to this. Number one, we could never say it's illogical. Number two, we could never say it's unbiblical. And number three, we could never say that God can't hold somebody accountable for something he determined to be done. Now, none of those three things would mean that you now have to accept it, because it's possible, at least theoretically, that that's a one-off instance, right? But it does mean that you do have to bite the bullet on this concept is biblical, is philosophically sound, and is, at least according to what God considers to be justice, is just. So now with that background, there's a litany of examples I can use that are biblical, but
there's one thing I would want to contend with, one point of it. So it's more, I think it's kind of a multi-or of don't flatten it out sort of thing. So I'm not convinced that, in other words, I think sometimes the idea would be that God's determined an outcome. That certainly is the case. That's undeniable. Now the question might be, like, on what moral grounds is he forcing someone to do certain things to get that outcome? Is it every detail that's necessary? And I know what the Calvinists would say to that. They're going to say, if what are you saying? He's like throwing dice or something. It's like, obviously, like every little thing has to happen just right. And so therefore God had to determine everything meticulously to get that outcome. And that's the part where I'm not sure if that's necessarily absolutely the case. You can make I think you can make a case for that. Certainly with particular things had to happen a certain way. And this is where it's like, I'm going to tread carefully, because another thing I would say is it seems to me that's where you gets into the question of, well, now let's trace it back. Now, if for anything to happen, every little thing had to be determined for that to come out that way. It's the only way possible. And I'm thinking, yeah, I can see where it seems that way, but I'm not sure that the text is wanting to say that. It seems like, in fact, I would even say it never come. It seems like it'd be awfully helpful for the Bible to actually say that, because it seems you could argue that the fact that it gives particular examples is reason to think that they're the exception and not the rule in some way. In other words,
well, and see, now that is sort of the crux of my point, though, right? Is so when we get to the is every detail like this, that would be a separate argument, one which I affirm, but one which is not in scope for what I'm trying to say right now, right? So you say, oh, that might be the exception, but if the exception exists, this is the key point of the argument. If the exception exists, those three arguments, which are the three most common arguments, can't be used anymore. Because if the exception exists one time, then one time it was biblical. And if it was biblical one time, then it's biblical all the time.
I just totally, to me, for me at least, it's as far as God determining outcomes, that's a certainty.
Right. So now let's get to a specific example, right? And I think there are many that can be used, but there's one which not only can be used, but it's so obvious that nobody except for the open theist denies it, and even some of the open theists don't. And that is the cross, right? And the reason it's so obvious is because Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 4, they just say it. They just say it in as plain as language as could ever possibly be said, right? Acts chapter 4 says all these different parties, Rome and Herod and Israel and the Gentiles, and they all gathered together to do whatsoever you determined beforehand for them to do, right? Now, notice here, it's not merely outcomes per se that are determined here, but he's saying he's determining actions. He's saying what they're going to do is what I determined beforehand they were going to do, speaking of the cross. And in Acts chapter 2, it says that they gathered together and slew Jesus by wicked hands. So now notice we have three different points we need to address before we continue. Number one, God predetermined the actions. Number two, they are considered evil for having done the things which God predetermined. And number three, they gathered themselves together, meaning they freely did what God predetermined. And those are three inescapable truths of this particular instance in the text, right?
Yeah, is the text wanting to say that they had by wicked hands to emphasize that God didn't make them have wicked hands, and that it's wanting to emphasize that that's of their own accord, but the outcome is God's determining because of their wicked hands? Or is it wanting to say that it's compatible, that is in God determined them to have wicked hands, to do that thing which he determined? I could see it either way. It seems, I want to say it's saying they had wicked hands to emphasize that it was their wicked hands were of them. He took their wicked hands to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish because their hands are wicked. You could say even.
So as far as the source of their wickedness, we can set that to the side for only a moment. We will have to come back to it, of course. But the reason we can set it to the side for only a moment is because in the end, what they're doing by their hands is the very thing which God has determined. So the outcome would be something like, people say God uses evil for his own righteous purposes. So like if an army invaded and I was a general and the army was, butchering the people of my city or of my land, right? Because they needed the food. They've left their own supply lines. They need food, they need munitions, things like that. Well, because of the fact that they've overextended themselves, I can use that to bring about an ultimately good outcome for my people, in that if I cut them off from home and force them to essentially just ransack the place, eventually it will be out of ingredients, right? And this is a tactic that armies have used throughout history. You just basically, you go behind them, you cut them off from their supply lines. They're going to run out of what would you call that? Supplies eventually. And they're going to run out of your supplies eventually. and they're going to piss the people off, which get the people to fight back. So I've used their evil for a good purpose, right? That's not what God's doing, though. God is saying the actual action, the invasion itself, was my plan, right? These hands are doing whatsoever. Notice they're doing whatsoever. The actions they're taking, they're doing whatsoever I had predetermined beforehand to be done. So he's not simply using evil people who have done evil things and creating some good out of it. He's actually determining the actions of their hands, the evil things to begin with, because that ultimately will bring about his righteous purposes, right? So, but
well,
there's still.
well, let's use the well, like there's hints in the prophets, right? Even right back to when they got the law of Moses, right? That they're going to disobey. Like God indicates that in prediction that they're going to harden their hearts or whatever, right? And then he uses that in Romans to say that he used that for to bring salvation to all the nations by the hardness of the hearts of the leadership or whatever. It seems to me, anyways. You can correct me if you think it's a little bit different, but it seems like the text says that, like it hints that they're gonna be rebellious, and then you kind of see that get that prediction come true when Jesus shows up. But that God uses that in his plan to, which ends up taking it to the nations, right? Because they don't accept Jesus. Now, do you think that means that he made them hard of heart? Because you can even argue, because I would say even when you see in the text of the New Testament, when they're saying things like their hearts were hardened, but then he uses, like he speaks in parables, so they won't know, and he like keeps it a secret. And then it says like they never would have killed the Lord of glory if they'd known what they were doing or whatever. And that kind of seems to be more applied to the principalities and the powers that are like influencing the people, perhaps. But my point is just that, like, to me, it seems like the text is wanting to say God sees that they're going to rebel, and then he uses that for a good purpose, kind of like with Joseph or whatever. In other words, to me, I don't think God, like, because like throughout the whole narrative before that, throughout scripture, just mankind in general, it's like God's saying he's being long suffering and he's going to bring about this plan to bring salvation to the nations. And he's desiring people to repent. Like he's being long suffering, like, and then doing stuff with them because people are hard hearted. Like, they wouldn't just spread out, from Babel. And so he like confuses the language, but like, you're basically saying, well, actually, no, he made them hard hearted so he could play the role of being long suffering and then like respond by confusing the languages and then making the Israelites hard so they would be rebellious so that they would reject the Messiah. And then that would be the way he brings it to me. It's like, no, there's some place in there in the middle somewhere where it's like the people are rebelling on their own accord and he's patiently enduring it to bring about his glory through the Messiah. And then he works that out in such a way where it brings it to the nations. But like, if you're going to say, no, he actually determined that they would be hard-hearted so that he would have to be long-suffering, then it kind of just like loses its meaning for me. Sorry, that was a long-winded spiel, but that's kind of where I'm at with it.
No, that's all right. Well, so what I would have to say to that is just ultimately this, I would again go back to that point of, and by the way, really briefly, I do want to point out that I do also affirm that God has somehow, because he's awesome enough to accomplish such a thing, he's determined this through free volition. So they do freely choose to do the things they do. He's not like dragging them around like puppets or anything like that, right? So that, at least that element of what you said.
Yes, and I'm not denying either that God didn't know that they were going to do this, like even from the creation, right? So I want to say like God's obviously ultimately responsible. I would argue, like knowing what they're going to do, and that's why I actually think in some way we should say that God is extending the atonement for anyone who will come to him, because I want to say, like, if you want to say getting God off the hook, I just logically speaking, like because I think good requires certain attributes according to what I understand God to be saying is good, and I believe that. I want to say like that's why I think like atonement has to be extended to everyone in some sort of way that makes it possible or something on some level. In other words, because he is ultimately taking responsibility because he is sovereign over everything, knowing what everybody's going to do ahead of time and implementing his plan in spite of people's rebellion. And so that's kind of a side note, I guess, or a side point I just want to make clear. But I agree in that sense. It seems like there's, yeah, I mean, go ahead. Sorry, keep going.
No, you're good. So with that qualification made, I again have to bring us back to the point of this particular text is going almost out of its way to say this is not merely God knowing what they would do and using that to his advantage, like a strategist, right? Not to say that God's not a strategist, but nevertheless, this particular text, I don't think it affords us that option, because the specific phraseology used is they gathered together to do whatsoever your hand predetermined for them to do, right? So it's not merely they do, and I have reacted to ultimately bring this about for my own glory, which would be impressive. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that conceptually, but it's actually arguing they gathered, what they're doing was my plan to begin with, right? And by the way, it's not even necessarily saying anything about their eternal state per se. There are some traditions, for example, that think Pontius Pilate converted. Scripture is silent on it, but like, for example, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, he's a saint. So they believe they have sufficient historical evidence to say he eventually converted. So this isn't even necessarily saying anything about their eternal state per se, but I digress.
Well, let me also say this in regards to I don't think God is looking down the corridors of time and having to like, oh, I got to respond. Oh, what do I do here? Oh, do this. Oh, and to get my outcome. That certainly isn't true. I would just say, and that's kind of what I was kind of getting at the beginning, or trying to get at with this idea of God. Like, he's not responding in a temporal sense. He's responding, but he is responding to the, what would you call that? He's responding to what they freely do. And so I would say but he's not taken by surprise by it. Like, in other words, he's like timelessly knowing what they're going to do. And so is in a sense like, causing, well, kind of, but is he, when he says, your God, I would say the language of like saying they're doing what you've determined to do. Yeah. There's a sense like, just like I would say with Pharaoh, it's like, he knew what Pharaoh was going to do in accord to how he sent his messengers and interjected, sent Moses to say this and to demand this. And it's like, he knew what the Pharaoh was going to respond with. And then he sent the necessary messenger or whatever, and knowing how Pharaoh would respond, just like when I say, like, my girlfriend, I knew her really well. I knew how to press her buttons. I knew how to say the right thing at the right time to get her a certain kind of response out of her. But in no way does that mean, even though my knowledge wouldn't be perfect in that sense, it's pretty damn perfect because like it worked every time. And like, I know how to do that. Right. So like, am I determining what's going to happen? Yes. In the sense where like, because of my perfect knowledge, when I send my messengers to say and to do certain things, and I know how that's going to affect people, right? There's some kind of weird difference there than saying, depending on what you mean, like, did God determine God hardened Pharaoh's heart because he knew exactly how the man would respond. But does that require God to be, saying you must be this way? Like, you could argue that even from God's refraining in history, like knowing what people will do, like, couldn't he have done this to soften them up a little bit and get them saved? Couldn't you always say God could do more, like, or prevented certain things in that person's life? And if not, like, then it's like, how is that not him determining the outcome anyways? Well, it's determining the outcome. It's just like, I don't know. There's a sense that it is determined by God's action or inaction, being in charge of everything and knowing everything. And to that, I would say that's true. But I'm going to say something like, well, I think maybe it needs to be developed, but it seems like there's enough text about the way God says things that he desires, and that, like, for instance, what more could I have done? Should we take that as saying, not meaning, the other, I forget what it is. Like, what more could I have done for my people, right? Like, how should we take that sort of phrase? Should we take it to mean, well, it doesn't mean that there's more. I mean, I don't want to say there's more he could have done. Like, how can we make that statement true, right? I'm trying to think of the verse. Sorry, I'm all over the place, but you get what I'm talking about? Like, God says, what more could I have done? What does he mean when he says something like that?
Well, and I do get what you're talking about, but there's, I think, two things that are kind of very important that are kind of being missed here, right? The first thing is when you talk about like the guy pressing the girlfriend's buttons, right? I use the example of a military strategist. You could also say like a chess master, right? I'm not caught by surprise because I'm baiting you into doing what I want to do. I mean, the first and obvious objection to that is just, well, that's just kind of determinism with extra steps. You know what I mean? Like I'm still ultimately determining your actions. Like maybe it is that all you're doing is explaining the mechanism behind how something can be both free and determined at the same time, and therefore compatibilism really is true. You know what I mean? But even besides that point, we still have this language that I feel like we haven't actually overcome, right? The accomplishment is actually not what he's saying is determined. The details that led to the accomplishment are what he's saying. You know, we always talk about the means and the ends. And usually we're talking about this the other way around. God predestines the ends, but he also predestines the means. Well, in this text, he's actually describing how he's predestined the means. Therefore, we get to the ends, right? So it's more than just the outcome. It has to be more than this.
What, the evil hands thing?
Not just the evil hands, but they gather together to do whatsoever you had determined for them to be done. So the actions of spitting on Christ, of falsely accusing him, of nailing him to the cross, all these, those are the things he's taking credit for predestining. The outcome of that is ultimately the crucifixion and the sending out of the gospel. But the outcome is not what's actually in reference here. It's the means particularly that are in reference here.
I'm not sure. I think that means he determined them to be like cruel, vindictive assholes. He's more like he's determined, like he did harden Pharaoh's heart, but he didn't determine that Pharaoh was in a position necessarily to be a dick from day one, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, and you're going to say,
well then you got a question for yourself then, though, right? Like if Herod Agrippa was not who Herod Agrippa was, then obviously everything falls apart, right? Because you have a leader in Israel who's saying, I'm not going to execute this guy. He didn't do anything.
Well, because he is who he is.
Right. But that's exactly my point, right? So if God is saying, I've determined for these specific actions to take place, right? In other words, this is the plan. We can't say, okay, well, that means he didn't necessarily determine that Herod would be the guy he was per se. And it's like, well, of course he did. That's part of the plan. If Herod's not the guy he is, he can't determine that Herod does what he does, right?
Well, I'm going to say it's the fact that Herod is who he is because of who Herod is. That's why God does it the way he does it. What's wrong with that?
Well, the first thing I would say is that we are back now to this sort of, for that to work, God has to be reactionary in the strong sense. Wow. And I emphasize in the strong sense because in the girlfriend's example or the chess master example, he pokes, he prods, and gets what he wants. But if it is entirely on the point of the other person, you know, sometimes in military strategy, somebody makes a blunder, and then you get the reaction.
He foreknew.
Right, but what are you even foreknowing at that point? Like
what the person has become at the right time.
But think about this, right? If you're foreknowing a hypothetical person, if given a hypothetical position, might do a hypothetical thing, who's to say, unless you are in some sense guaranteeing that result, that such hypothetical person even exists?
Well, that's what foreknowledge is. I mean, it sounds like to me you're now arguing that foreknowledge necessitates cause. No,
I'm saying because you would say that.
I don't think. Let me say this. I don't think we know is what I'm saying. I don't think it says. It doesn't tell us how God knows, just that he does.
Well,
And then,
I'm not saying how does he know, right? I want to try and be as clear as I possibly can here, right? I'm saying let's just assume he does, okay? If and we're talking before any of this has occurred, right? We can even say before the foundation of the world. If God knows before Herod ever comes to power, if Herod exists, he will be this sort of person. And if he is this sort of person, then when he becomes ruler, he will do this sort of thing, right? All that God at that point knows is counterfactual knowledge. If this, then that. But that hasn't actually occurred, right? It could be that Herod doesn't exist. It could be that Herod doesn't come to power. It could be that Herod does exist and does come to power, but that his father passed away at such a young age that he doesn't have the influence of that absolutely maniacal man. Right. In other words, all of these are, this is kind of like what the Molinist talks about, right? All of these are potential timelines that God could create, right? He hasn't actualized any of them yet. It's not that he doesn't know. It's not that his knowledge is necessitating a certain causation. It's just to say at that moment when he knows thus and such is true, he only knows thus and such is potentially true.
I think it's problematic. That's where I think the Molinism is something's wrong with that idea. Like, because I don't think he's like going through his Rolodex of potential worlds and going, I think I'll choose this one. I think I'll deal myself these cards and then deal with them as I receive them. I don't think that's quite right. But I don't think God has a Rolodex because I don't think he's limited on processing power. So in other words, because he's timeless, there's not moments of time where he's considering different worlds. He's just creating the world in some way, and then it's just like he's just sovereign over it, and it's just
right.
That world.
I think we're still kind of getting away from the point, though, right? Because what I'm trying to illustrate to you is if we, and by the way, I don't agree with middle knowledge as given by Molina, because I think that God is ultimately the source of knowledge. But just to be, I think God does no counterfactuals. We'll put it that way, right? So we'll say that you agree that God has some form of middle knowledge in that he knows what would have happened if, right? But in the moment before anything has happened, God knowing these hypothetical truths, if this, then that, right? He is still ultimately in control of making sure this or that happens. Herod doesn't have to be born, but God can make sure that it happens.
Right.
And he doesn't have to, right? And he doesn't have to be king, but God can make sure that that happens. And he doesn't have to be raised by Herod the Great, but God can make sure that that happens. And Jesus doesn't have to show up at that time, but God makes sure that, you see what I mean? So it gets to this point of where we're saying, okay, God has foreknowledge. All right. And we agree foreknowledge isn't causal. Agreed. And we agree that God knows counterfactuals. Also,
and that foreknowledge and predestination mean two different things.
Exactly. So we can affirm all those things, but now we have a really weird position we put ourselves in where before any of this happens, the only person who can set the dominoes in order such that God's potential knowledge becomes actual knowledge in that instance, and by potential, I'm speaking temporally, God's knowledge is always actual, but I just mean that it hasn't happened in time, right? The only person capable of doing that is God, right? He gets to flick the first domino to make sure a certain set of facts end up becoming actual facts and not merely hypothetical facts where he knows what could have happened if.
Yes. I would want to say something like, I don't think everything is determined from the first domino falling over necessarily, I guess, in some sort of real way. I don't know. Or that, there's a sense where you're saying, it seems to me that there is a sense where you're saying like, reason I don't accept the domino or the Molinist. I'm not even sure what Craig is, if he's even trying to say that about it, but it's just like a way of us understanding that, saying it in a language we can understand or understand it in a way we can understand, or, you know what I mean? Like he's choosing between possible worlds. I think it's just a way of trying to say that there's actual middle knowledge that's potential, like possible. Like, can God change his mind? And, that sort of thing, to make it brief here.
Yeah, like it was potentially possible that Saul could have, for example, obeyed Jesus, right? Like that's
yeah. And God just knew that he wouldn't. God just knew that he wouldn't, but he actually could have. And that's where the whole, like, God's knowledge determines it or not. Like,
yeah.
no.
And so now here's, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's all. That was all I was gonna say. Just what's causally first is the question. It's like, that's what I was trying to get at the beginning too. It's like, hold on, I'll be right back. Go ahead. I can hear you.
Okay. So you let's take that Saul example, right? So there, by possible world, all that Craig is trying to say is it is genuinely hypothetically possible that Saul obeys God, and as a result, such a domino effect comes into play where we're actually calling Jesus son of Saul and not son of David, right? So it's not like a literal possible timeline or possible universe, right? Now there's a question of, okay, if it was genuinely possible for Saul to do that, and let's say Saul had some reason, any reason, even a litany of reasons for doing what he did, and that if those reasons were different, he might have done, and in God's case would have done, because God actually knows for a fact, something else, right? So, like, as an example, if Saul had ruled over a army that was more of the demeanor that Joshua ruled over, devout in other words, perhaps he would not have caved into all the things that they said. Or if Saul was raised by a father who was a little bit more robust in his disciplinarian parenting, maybe Saul would have been more of a I follow strict orders kind of guy. In other words, is there a possible setup where Saul's personality is different in such a way that he decides to do what God wanted him to do instead of what God didn't want him to do? If we answer that question, yes, well, now we're in a very pretty predicament, right? Because who could have set up those subjunctive conditionals, which is what Craig calls them, right? And we all know the answer. It's God. God could have set up the subjunctive conditionals in such a way that Saul had a fundamentally different nature about him and therefore decided to do something else.
That's
right?
The idea of, like, God's lack of interference is potentially the outcome's happening by his lack of doing something. So it's like that makes him responsible anyway.
Exactly.
Could have done that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's look at what some people are saying. Let's see what Dan is saying here real quick. It's just so you can get an interaction with you here. Even growing CJ's low view of God's knowledge. That maybe had Dan ask a question if you want to, and I'll put it up. So think it through for a second. I see you commenting a lot, but go ahead, CJ.
Well, let me just, because all of this is all to demonstrate why I think God is in some sense building up even the background, right? But all of that is also ultimately not relevant to the initial point I was making, right? Which was in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 2, God is saying the actions that they took, they could have been equally evil and taken different actions, or they could have even taken actions that were in some sense better, and therefore, even though we could say there's a hypothetical world in which they're this evil, in this world they're actually, in other words, in reality, they actually are not that evil because they didn't do that thing, right? Ultimately,
there's something wrong with that to me, like the idea that God chooses what, like in operation, you could say God could choose between different worlds, and then each one they're free, and he chooses between the ones that are free. I'm not sure if I buy that. To me, it seems like God exhaustively determining the world by choosing between different potential worlds with where creatures have free will. To me, that there's something that seems like a contradiction.
It is. it sounds like a contradiction to you because it is a contradiction. Molinism is determinism with extra steps.
You can't exhaustively determine what limit, like libertarian. That's like a category, or it's an explicit contradiction. Like the point of libertarian free will is to say that, in some sense, there's different ways of arguing for it, but that it's that the agents are not being determined. So it's like you can't determine what free will agents can do or it's not making that distinction with the kind of free will you're talking about.
Exactly. Libertarian free will, by definition, is indeterminism. So if we're going to say that he chose the timeline where they all did the certain things that they did, it's all you're saying is I'm actually a compatibilist, but I don't really like the implications of that, so I'm going to say I'm not. And
do you think it's possible for God to know what libertarian free will creatures that are indetermined will do?
I mean,
like, is it at least potentially, like, or like, could you say? I'm sure certain versions of libertarian free will, which I wouldn't necessarily. There's a sense that I'm a compatibilist in the sense where I think, obviously, there's like causes. I just don't know if it's the whole picture. It's like saying, like it's evidently true. Like cause and effect in a sense is the concept of science, like of cause and effect, is at least a sort of compatibilism. But I think you can kind of apply it in different areas differently. In other words, I think because to me, compatibilism is the idea that like you choose stuff, but there's factors that you can talk about, being reasons. There's reasons for stuff, right? Does that mean compatibilism's true? I mean, seems like it.
Well, one of the things that I think, if I could just be very, very bold and not in an offensive way, but we always get caught up in these. Okay, but did God, set up like the reason why they did that and all that? And I think we just went on a whole roundabout as far as why I think that there's some veracity even to that statement. But in a way, it's kind of a retreat, and I say this with respect to my libertarian brethren, because I do consider you guys brethren. But the reason I say that it's a retreat is because, we always start this conversation with, how can somebody do something and then God hold them responsible? Or how can God determine, this is a variation of that same claim, how can God determine we do X and also we freely choose X, right? And then we start to explain, okay, well, look here in the Bible, this is an example of God said, I determined them to do X. Also, they gathered together to do X. So there's determinism, there's free will. Also, they did X by wicked hands. There's judgment. And then the retreat then comes in where it's like, yeah, but we don't know if he determined the internal mechanism that led them to do that. And it's like, well, that wasn't the initial point of contention, though. The contention was the action. Can God say, I have determined the action, and also you freely chose the action, and therefore you are responsible for the actions taking place, right? The motivation is there.
I don't feel like I'm retreating. I think there's the question is, in what ways what things does God determine? Like there's a sense where you can say everything's determined because he gets the outcome that he saw and want and desired and made to happen.
Right, but it's not. This is where I gotta kind of hold your feet to the fire a little bit, though, right? Because it's not the outcome. He's not talking about the outcome. He's talking about the actions that led to the outcome. I decided to.
I know. I hear you. It just seems to me like at that point, it's the way he gets the action is going to be that particular way, which like this is like when he sends the armies against Israel. It's kind of like you could say he refrains from restraining them to protection, and so like he is determining that that army attacks his people and beats up the women and rapes them and whatever because that's what they're going to do. And right, so
but that's where I was saying, and I just want to be very clear. I'm saying this with the utmost respect. I'm not trying to in any way impugn your integrity, because I don't think you're being dishonest. But that's why I was saying it's a retreat, because now you've moved back. We're not talking about the actions anymore. We're granting that God determines the actions. what we're saying about, but maybe the motivations weren't determined. But if we're already there, you've already granted me my compatibilism. God determines the actions of free creatures, and also they freely chose to do those things, right? Now we have an active question of where does the motivation comes from, but that's a debate that you and I and Theodore Beza and John Calvin and R.C. Sproul could all have together as Calvinists. You know what I mean? But if you're willing to go to that point, you're already granting, oh, okay, God did actually determine. He determined for Judas to betray Jesus. Also, Judas freely betrayed Jesus. Also, Judas is morally responsible for having betrayed Jesus. And
Well,
that's
yeah, I believe all those things.
right. I know you do. And that's why I think this is such an important point, right? Because that we've just like essentially, you know, those cartoons where they like grab the tablecloth and all the dishes start flying in the air and doing tricks and stuff like that. It's usually like a Tom and Jerry or Looney Tunes or something like that, right? That's what we've essentially done now to the objections against compatibilism, because we've granted God actually can hold creatures morally responsible for things he's already determined beforehand for them to do. And we've granted that they even freely chose to do those things, even though God determined for them to do it. So we've just agreed, at least in logical principle. We haven't agreed that it's a rule always, right? But at least in logical principle, we've agreed compatibilism is not only viable, but it's biblical. It's happened, right?
Well, yeah, compatible. That's what I'm saying. I don't think it's a retreat. I mean, God. I just don't think he had to make them be a raping army in order to determine that at that time he'll, not stop them from doing it in judgment of his people by say, for instance, why do you think how many times did Israel get attacked during their festivals in the land when they were right with God? God protected them, even though armies that wanted to invade them could have ransacked them during their festivals, right? And it's and then when they reject Jesus, when the temple's destroyed, I think it was during one of the festivals, right? When they're all doing their festival. So something like that, God protects them. That's determining people from, he's stopping them from attacking when it would be a good time to attack. He thwarts their desire to take advantage of his people because he offers protection. You could say, if he withdraws intervention to keep us, protecting his people, in that sense, it makes sense that he could judge the army for being cruel, evil army, but also in another sense, he's determining them to judge his people because of, you know what I mean? But that doesn't mean he's made them to be evil for that purpose, right? He's there's a sense where he's withdrawing his protection, which in a sense, on a moral level or whatever, it's kind of like the opposite determinist sort of thing. You could talk about God withdrawing protection. In other words, he goes hands off on something he had his hands on in some way that we don't really know exactly what that entails, right? Does he send a mouse at the right time to scare the guy when he's going to take a piss so that the general doesn't send the army? Or does he blind them or send bees, to bother them so that they can't attack his people? How does God prevent armies from attacking his people when they're vulnerable, when they're doing their services to him or whatever, right? He has to do something in real time to prevent it. And it's is that,
well, he has to do something in real time to cause it too, right? Because what if he withdraws his hedge of protection and Assyria is just not interested, or they happen to be weak at that
point? Right. I would say, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. So I would just say that what you're describing right now to me is an in-house dispute within Calvinism. In other words, obviously what we're having right now is an in-house dispute within Christianity. But the objections you're bringing up, in my opinion, is you're in the house, you've gone to one of the rooms, and that room is labeled Calvinism. You know what I mean? Like now we're discussing what's the mechanism God uses to predetermine everything. But we're already agreeing that in order to get to that point, I'm not saying you're actually agreeing, but I mean the implication of arguing that point. We're already agreeing that he is in fact predetermining all this stuff, and now we're curious about the mechanisms, which, you know, me and Ryan would likely have maybe not the exact same disagreements, but similar disagreements, right? I tend to hang on one second.
Yeah,
Sorry, I had to sneeze.
I mean, that's kind of how I've always thought about it. I mean, I would say if that's a kind of Calvinism, I don't care. I'm sure.
Well, and this is actually a part of the reason, and I'm sorry if it does annoy you, because I don't mean that. But part of the reason why I've said for some time I think that you are a future Calvinist budding, and you just kind of don't realize it yet, is because the things that you're willing to grant, at some point, I think the light's going to come on and you're going to realize, wait a minute, I don't actually have a problem with determinism. I'm just trying to think through the mechanisms of what exactly happens in determinism. You know what I mean?
Well, that's why I think there's rule. I think God has set forth rules of engagement, and I tend to lean more on the idea that, like I was describing with, well, see, I believe that the great controversy is right. So I think God did, like when he was. I'm gonna say God does determine things. I would want to say it's more of like he probably has some sort of rules of engagement where he's not just, you know, like, but even you're gonna, in a sense, I think agree with that, in the sense like he's not being a puppeteer, but he is intervening or lacking intervention to get certain things to happen. I would just want to say he doesn't have to like mold every action along the way to get it to that desire. In some sense, it's I don't really want to think about it in temporal terms. I want to say like, not that he's being taken by surprise or he's having to like on the fly figure out what to do. I don't think that's true, but I think there's rules of engagement that are necessitated for responsibility to make sense. In other words, like I think God knew what Cain was going to do, but he like the way he intervenes is to like, I think he's basically trying people in the sense where he's proving people for good to be good or evil, and they're actually responding to that. And the way he intervenes in such a way where that actually is going to make sense for responsibility. And I think sometimes I want to preserve that sort of notion, but I think just logically, according to the text, you do have to say God intervenes, and that may as well, in a sense, be a determinist. It's like I said, that's why I use that pushing buttons thing. It's just like that's intervening when he didn't have to, and obviously he's intervening because it actually is. If he didn't intervene, he wouldn't get the outcome he wanted, right? So like the intervention is determining things, and that's what I mean by outcome, more so than I mean meticulous. So but the fact of the matter is those interventions are changing the course of history, and having perfect knowledge, you are manipulating the person to get a determined outcome. And along the way, that requires, causing the person to do certain things. And so, but I think their moral culpability still to require for there to be moral culpability that makes any kind of sense as we understand it as humans and how we do justice. It can't be meticulous. That's what I guess I would say. I'll give you the last word because I gotta go, but.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate the conversation, and I would also say, if I may, some of these things are things that I actually address in that, and that's not to say that you're going to read this book and all of a sudden you're going to be a Calvinist, Jamie. That's not what I'm saying.
I'm reading it. I got sidetracked here for the last week or so, but I'm through. Through already. So
no, and I know, and take your time because I'm well aware of why you're sidetracked. So, I'm not a priority, is what I'm trying to say. But the reason I bring it up is to say, hopefully, in the written form, I lay out a little bit more clearly for you what this is, because honestly, it really does sound to me like you're, Beza and Calvin disputed, not necessarily with each other per se, but as to things like infralapsarianism and supralapsarianism, or what exactly, or like Luther was a fatalist, but Calvin's a compatibilist, right? Or so on and so forth. So like, to me, it almost sounds like the way that you're speaking about these things, you're in, like I said, you're in the room with me, kind of discussing, all right, so all these actions, all the events that take place, in other words, okay, let's say they are determined, but I don't think God has to meticulously determine the motivations. And if that ends up being the case, which I think it is, I mean, I just say, okay, well, we can dispute about that in particular. We might not agree with that, but welcome to the camp. You're a Seventh-day Calvinist now. You know what I mean? But which, by the way, you can be a Calvinist and still be a Sabbatarian. I think. Well, a Seventh-day Sabbatarian.
I think that I'm willing to grant a little more than most people. I would just say it does come down to kind of the ability to do otherwise in a real sense. And but I think God brought up Job to Satan. I think God set that up. So
yeah, exactly. And who knows? Maybe one day, because we both live in the same state, maybe one day we'll found Bonners Ferry first church of the first Calvinist church of the Seventh Day or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it needs the Reformed need a Seventh-day church, I think.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I've even, like I said, I've toyed with the idea before of having a congregation that is willing to meet on Saturday and Sunday to kind of make everybody happy. But I don't know. I'm getting off into sort of territory I find fun, but not even the point. Yahoo just said, I think I know one Calvinist Hebrew. I wonder.
Well, that's right.
I'm curious,
right.
Yahoo, are you speaking about me?
No, I think he knows somebody else.
If he is, that is.
I think he knows a Calvinist that like got tangled up with Hebrew roots people. He probably moved to the wrong place, and then because it's kind of undeniable that because I got to go, but it seems to me I get so irritated at people. They're so like I was listening to Kelby and Paul, and I got really pissed because like they make it really hard. Like I don't want to be a fraud, where I'm like, oh, let me just sweet talk you. Like you're pissing me off. Like, but at the same time, I'm like, you're definitely confused, and it irritates me that you're like, that's the constant thing is, oh, you're a Seventh-day Adventist. Let me just dismiss you. And it's like Seventh-day Adventists care about what the Bible says, and they're serious about it. So it's like, don't like if you're going to go that route, you can't really take you seriously. I think you're just, and then it starts to make me think how there's a real problem in Christianity and like conspiratorial thinking. And it's just like, it's really sad because it kind of like, you start to think it's not a genuine faith. Like when you see so many different people BSing so bad, you get what I'm saying? And I mean that like not in like a derogatory sense, like it's actually scary. It's disappointing and kind of starts making people like, you start to wonder like if it's even real with people at all. And I don't like to think about, I'm not saying like I think about people that way, but it starts to make you think that way because it's just like, they're not being genuine. So many people are not being genuine. And, it's just like, no, I won't say anymore, but anyway, that's what it seems like sometimes. And it just such a lack of like
charity.
Like in other words,
I just said charity. Is it like a lack of charity?
Yeah, I think I really do think it stems though from just not living like a Christian and just being so set on thinking of it as like affirming the right propositions and nothing more. I think that is a problem because then you get really defensive. You're not like living a life of service, and by you I mean whoever, me, anyone in any denomination. It's just like it's turned it into just like you have to say yay or nay to the right proposition, and that's what matters. But I don't think that is what matters, although those things are important. This is where I think Kevin, Beyond the Fundamentals, is on to something with issues in Christianity, putting aside the Calvinist thing. It's just regarding, this idea that that's what matters. This is like when people are, this is the last thing I'll say, and I've noticed this recently. It's like, the Trinity is important because there's a reason for that. Because Jesus is God and they are one and unified, right? That has implications. And the implications of getting the Bible right is why it matters. But no one ever wants to apply it. They want to call you a heretic if you do or don't believe the Trinity. But you might not believe in the Trinity, but affirm the right teachings of Scripture regarding things that are important, that not believing the Trinity could screw up, right? Like thinking Jesus' commandments are different than his Father's, for instance. That doesn't make sense if the Trinity is true, for instance, right? So who gives a damn if you affirm the Trinity if you make Jesus and his Father disunified regarding the law, okay, for instance? All of a sudden, I don't think God gives a damn about you affirming the Trinity if you don't affirm why that matters. And so, you can take your Trinity doctrine and stick it up your butt, even though it's true, because you've just turned it into are you saying it for the right, are you saying the proposition? Well, the proposition only matters because of how that affects how you understand Scripture. God doesn't care if you affirm the Trinity or not, in the sense where on those grounds that I'm talking about. I don't think God cares less if you raised your hand when somebody said, do you say yes to this? It matters if you actually believe it, and believing it actually means something more than just affirming a proposition. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's no, I think I agree with that. And I think, and you've already clarified, it's not like the propositions are irrelevant, but what you're saying almost reminds me of Isaiah, right? Where he's talking about, he's talking to people who affirm all the propositions, right? But he's saying I don't care about your sacrifices and all this kind of stuff. How do you treat the poor? How do you treat the widow? And it's not the exact thing that you're talking about, but it is the same concept, I think.
No,
where
it
it's
is. God doesn't care about that sort of thing. He cares about your heart, your surrender or whatever, I think. And it's that's what I'm saying. It's it is that sort of, it's exactly that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's exactly that, actually. I don't think could be more important to get. Honestly.
Well, and by extension, by the way, if those are the same thing, and I agree with you, they definitely are, then essentially this speech you just given right now, if anybody takes issue with it, they're going to have to take issue with Isaiah. And it's really, it's almost that simple. You know what I mean? And I don't mean to simplify it, but it's true. It's like this. If you are saying, well, I affirm all the right things, I circled A on all of the right propositions, A being yes, I guess, because that's just what I decided. But I in no sense am living that out. Really, all you're doing is you're just deluding yourself. And, that's, I think that's where we get the Lord Lorders too, to reference another scripture, the ye who work iniquity.
Yeah, and
because they think they
not work
do.
salvation, by the way. That's what they're going to say. But they're actually the ones turning doctrine into the works. It's not so much about works, because it's about understanding the root and then what actually can change people, because God is in the business of changing hearts. He's not in the business of getting you to affirm the right proposition so that he doesn't have to burn you forever. He's about the reason salvation by faith alone is important is because when you actually believe that, it results in actions, not because you're saved by the actions, but because understanding the truth is the only way that it works. And you can't get there on your do-it-yourself religion. That's what I mean when I say that. It's like the understanding how it works and believing that is the only way to actual real meaningful change in the heart, I think. But then people take that and they abuse it, but they don't even realize what they're doing. They're making affirming the right proposition as to being the thing that matters, when that doesn't change hearts. But that doesn't mean right doctrine doesn't matter either, because you have to believe God. Believing God is not a mere ascension. It can't be. It doesn't make, it would be just turning it into works upside down, because that's why I try to tell people, like, the Pharisees' problem wasn't that they obeyed God too well. The problem Jesus said they had was that they were frauds, that they looked good on the outside, but they were bad on the inside. That has serious implication when you think about it. Like, for me, it's like they were offended when somebody said, by the way, just because you're sons of Abraham doesn't mean you're good, just because of that, at least on an individual level, right? He said, I think that's what he meant when he said flesh and blood can't enter the kingdom of heaven. He didn't merely mean like substance so much as he meant like, you're being of Abraham's seed doesn't make you automatically good, no matter what. It's like you have the truth, and so you have that advantage. But having, so that's where I think it's like when I hear people say once saved, always saved, and they point to Jesus, I'm like, yes, that's right. But it's not. He's not gonna it's not because you believe in once saved, always saved. It's that you believe in the Son, which is to believe on the Son is to know the Son, and to know the Son is eternal life, because it's in him that there exists eternal life, like substance in substance, which is granted to you when you know him. And so it's like, that's what I think it gets twisted or whatever. Like, but I don't totally disagree. It's like, it's complicated. But anyway, I'm done. Last word.
Last word I'll have is just, I appreciate you having me on, and I thought it was a really good discussion. So hopefully we'll get to
Thanks, man. All right, man. Good talking. See you later.
Absolutely. God bless.